Guys, I can't do this.
Your ability to dance and smile while severely ill is impressive as shit,
Yeah.
I must say.
Very impressive.
I am dying. It's true. So I think it's working. I think.
We're live.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure we are. It looks
We
like we
feel
are.
live.
Oh, yes, we are. Okay, confirmation.
Great.
Good.
Great.
This is very professional. We're here. We're here with Chris Maxwell. It says
We're
your
here.
Name. We're here. It says your name with an arrow. You can't see it, but it does, and it's in the stupidest font in the world.
Oh, even better.
Second only to Comic Sans. Okay, what are we? We're rated R. Why are we rated R, Jess?
Because I cuss a lot.
Bad words.
Bad words.
Bad words. Okay.
And today there's going to be extra bad words because we're going to talk about money.
Things we don't have.
No one has anything good to say about money.
I do.
That's not true.
I want it.
That's not a good thing to say about money. That's just a thing.
I need it.
Sure.
Please give it to me.
All of that's bad.
Okay, well, fine.
So Des, who are you?
I'm me. No.
More than that. Say more. Introduce yourself.
We never do this. So,
I know, but we have a guest.
I'm Dese'Rae Stage. I run a project called Live Through This. It's a series of portraits and stories of suicide attempt survivors across the U.S. If you want to see the stories on Live Through This, you can see them at livethroughthis.org. Okay, who are you guys?
Well, I'm Jess, and I'm doing this with you every time so far. And I work in Colorado for our crisis line and peer support line, and like to talk shit about suicidology. So that's who I am. So I'm here for that. I'm mostly here for the beef corner, even though the title of it makes me feel weird.
Makes me feel very queasy.
And then we have a guest.
Do you know who you can blame for the name of Beef Corner? Do we remember?
Leah Harris.
Fucking Leah Harris.
Yeah.
It gives me like metaphorical meat sweats. And I don't like it. But I'm gonna participate. I'm
sweats concern.
Do I have to do the hand thing?
Only if you get sat on your hand.
Okay. I'm Chris Maxwell.
To give Chris a prison tattoo.
I will. I'm going to see him at a conference soon, so I'll give him a sad tattoo.
I'm Chris Maxwell. I am the communications coordinator for the American Association of Suicidology, of which tonight I am not speaking for. My views are my own, and I don't represent the organization or any of our members. I speak for me.
Yeah, that's a good caveat to put in front before we talk about this topic, I think.
It's like in the Twitter bios, retweet is not an endorsement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Should I also put up one of those things?
Stuff, but I probably should.
I should also put up, should I say something like, if anybody shares this, they can't have my private information, and Facebook, you don't own me, and...
Yeah, definitely do that.
Hold on. Wait, I'm gonna fix it.
What are you fixing?
Chris is not speaking for AAS.
Oh God.
I just want everybody to be able to see.
Put it on the screen for you.
Yeah, it's over his eyeballs. Okay.
So like last time, we have 3 sections to what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about government funding and suicide prevention. Then we're going to do the beef corner, and then we're going to talk about suicide prevention and nonprofits. So yeah, it's going to be a really fun time. Buckle up, things are fucked up. And I didn't even prepare that one. That was cute. So we can start with that first first one, right? Unless, Des, do you have other stuff you need to do first?
No, I'm gonna sneeze on some stuff while you guys talk. Also,
Rose.
Yeah, where the fuck is my mom? She's not here.
I don't know.
I don't like it. Okay, go on.
Well, you sneeze, call your mom, whatever you have to do. Chris now talks about the government.
I'll be here listening and learning.
So, Chris, do you want to start with that topic, or do you want me to start?
How do we even start with this? What sort of framework are we working with here? Because they, like, generally, right? The government. What do we know? I guess I'll say some things that I know.
Yeah.
About how the government funds suicide prevention, and there are a couple of different facets that government funding goes through, and it's things like the Health and Human Services. Through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is known as SAMHSA, or as some people call it, SAMHSA.
Does everyone say that?
You'd be surprised. And then, but so like that's its own big kind of bureaucracy that has a whole bunch of aspects to it. But then we also have things like the National Institute of Health, which is allocated a certain amount of money every year to fund research on certain things. Unfortunately, suicide prevention is not funded very well from the NIH. We have the NIMH, right, which is mental health. What other ones do we know? What other ones are there?
CDC.
Yep. That one's more epidemiological, right? Like that's not necessarily applied stuff.
Yeah, it's usually public health approaches to suicide, so or suicide prevention, not public health suicides. And that's part of their injury control and violence prevention departments.
Leia says the CIA.
The CIA.
They fund suicide, though. That's different.
Well, 7 minutes and you made it weird.
The little pills that you get as an agent.
There you go.
Yeah.
I just felt like explaining my joke.
So,
the berries.
Des, go sneeze or something.
And it took 7 minutes to yell at Des.
Yeah.
That's not nice.
I'm so like you. So I think for me, so we know that all those organizations exist and that they provide funding for suicide prevention activities. The sort of goals of all those organizations are usually on like 5-year strategic plans that are pretty influenced by who is in leadership positions in different government offices. Sort of the other piece that to me that's really important about how all of those institutions function is that they do not operate independently, although they might claim to in a lot of ways. So I think that funding is often distributed by those organizations in ways that consolidate power within suicide prevention. So they fund specific types of activities that are connected with like work that they want to promote. And it's typically work that reaffirms anything that's been published or iterated by those organizations before. And they also have often strong alliances with specific nonprofits or other agencies. For example, like the Lifeline has a strong connection with SAMHSA. So if you were to get funding from SAMHSA to do suicide prevention work in your state also is required to answer Lifeline calls, a certain percentage of Lifeline calls for that region. So these things don't all operate independently; they're all intertwined, and oftentimes those things are promoted at a deficit to the state. So when you get that SAMHSA funding for a suicide prevention grant, they're not also funding those Lifeline calls that you have to pick up. You have to find a way to fund them in your state on its own. So they basically consolidate power and consolidate the types of interventions that people are going to be able to receive.
That's what I was going to say. Is that so? With any of these funding sources, they typically come with some sort of criteria or like a standardized training that they've approved or that they have worked closely to develop. Sometimes these trainings come from previous funding from the government organizations. So things like mental health first aid or Living Works Assist. And I'm not saying any like I'm not putting any of these on some sort of moral spectrum, whether good or bad. But I'm just saying like some of these things have had government support in creating and developing them. And so then when they are heavily promoted and or mandated by groups that are then funded by the governments, you can kind of see where there's this kind of like you were saying, consolidation.
Yeah.
I don't want to say incestuous kind of relationship, but that's almost what it feels like. Yes.
I do want to say that. Incestuous relationship thing, but that's
me.
Yes.
We have a question.
Ooh.
Okay. Kate wants to know, do people really call those lifelines?
No.
I mean, people do call the lifelines. And a lot of times, depending on where you are, there's capacity to answer those calls or not. And because of the way all this government support is structured, what kinds of interventions are able to be provided on those lines are determined also by the federal government. So communities don't get to have local discussions about how they want to serve people locally. And there's not room for sort of change on a small level to happen. It has to kind of come through that big overarching government body. And most of the way that those funds are distributed, if they're not funding specific research projects, they're typically going to a state office of some kind, and then it's getting distributed throughout the state. So what happens is your local state government is applying for funding to pay for certain things, and then nonprofits in your local area can try to get the grant support to run those initiatives that have been determined by the state when they apply for that federal funding. And they're on, often long-term grants, anywhere between 2 and 5 years. So the agenda for what is going to happen in suicide prevention in your state, or what there's going to be dollars for, is pretty much determined every few years by whoever happens to be working in that office in your state at the time. Whoever
gets the grant.
Right.
Yep. Jessica said that she's called the lifeline, and the phone counselor bored the suicidal thoughts right out of her. I thought that was it's too bad.
Yeah. Well,
it's too bad.
That's unfortunate. I feel like we answer lifeline calls here, and I hope that the people that I train are not doing that. But I mean, is that a good outcome? I don't know. How does she feel about it? Was that a good outcome, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean that's a protective factor, right?
Yeah.
On some level.
I guess, yeah. Depends on the goal, right? Is the goal preventing suicide through porno?
That's true. That's true. Is that giving someone a better quality of life?
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So to piggyback on what you were kind of talking about, and talking from personal experience. So I worked at a crisis line for almost. I mean, I worked on the crisis line for almost 5 years. I worked at the crisis line for 6 or 7. And so I went from talking on the phones. So I went through that whole training aspect, which at the time the training was something like 130 hours. It included assist being a trained in assist, which is a 2-day training, and then several weeks of mentorship with people on the line. But going from that kind of perspective, and not really we got some sense of we needed to go fundraise, and we didn't have money for new computers, or we didn't have money for new phones. things like that. But it was always like, why isn't the Lifeline funding this crisis center, or why isn't the federal government funding this crisis center if we're answering calls that are coming from an infrastructure that's national? And then, of course, when I moved up into a grant, so we were the arbiters of a GLS grant. For those who don't know, it's a Garrett Lee Smith grant, and it's a youth suicide prevention focused grant that's granted by SAMHSA through HHS. And that one in particular was I don't remember exactly how much. It was millions of dollars, I think, over the course of like 3 years. So that was an interesting deal. It was supposed to go to the state. The state didn't want to actually apply for the grant. And so then it ended up, and we can get into this later, but it went to the nonprofit that answered the crisis line for the state. So it was a weird thing. So I don't know why I'm rambling about this, but basically what I'm saying is that it's very complicated sometimes. And this was a crisis center with a budget of like $100,000 a year, being awarded this massive grant that was not an infrastructure building grant. So we didn't have the staff, we didn't have the tools or the equipment to really do this stuff. So they had to ramp things up within like 3 months to really get things going. But so, again, this is a crisis center that was largely funded by donations, private donations. At that point in time, they were not funded by the state. They were barely funded by the city. I think they had a small United Way stipend, but like a lot of people don't realize that crisis centers in particular are not funded well a lot of times, and they're largely staffed by volunteers.
Yeah, and I happen to work at a crisis center that's not staffed by volunteers, but we are also until like without certain circumstances that are new ones, we also haven't been funded to answer the Lifeline. So we've been answering those calls just at a deficit, and that's a pretty common experience for crisis centers that maybe are existing already and then add on Lifeline calls. So all of those kind of institutions are set up to build on each other and to make sure that services are getting provided in specific ways. And I think there's that is intentional, and there are reasons that they want to do that, is that they want to have consistency in service delivery and things like that. The problem is that there isn't actually an evidence base for most of what we do in suicide.
Hold up.
So
Hold up.
You have 2 minutes to talk about the government.
So because there's not actually an evidence base for so much of what we do, we are basically saying we are going to keep doing this same stuff over and over, despite not seeing the outcomes that we think we are supposed to. And we are going to financially back only the things that perpetuate our decisions that we made whenever, I don't know how many years ago, about what the right way to do this is. Request as a part of your grant process, you have to report on outcomes, but outcomes are always just numbers served. And if we were really reporting on outcomes about how many people die or don't, if that's the outcome that they're looking for in suicide prevention, which it usually is, no one would get funded again because the numbers are always going up.
Yeah. Or those that attempted, right? But it depends on the data sources you get that from too. And I guess it depends on what sort of thing you're talking about too, in terms of evidence base. I mean, there was that research study that came out 4 years ago about how locations that were awarded GLS saw reductions in suicide up to 2 years after the funding stopped, and then the rates went back up. But the point is, when you dump money into a location, it can potentially reduce suicide rates.
Right, but we don't know which things they did reduce suicide. No.
Not at all.
Not at all.
So, is it time for Beef Corner?
I think it's time for Beef Corner.
Okay, hold on. It's time for Beef corner. It's beef corner. Okay, wait, where's the thing? I'm really
Did
good
you just
at
make up
technology. No, we're having beef corner, Chris.
I think you just made up the jingle.
It's very beefy, this corner.
This is another one of those times where Des can see things and you all can see things and Chris cannot. So we're just laughing at Des laughing.
Ooh, there's a cow on this one.
Chris is watching.
Yeah.
Who wants to go first?
Des, I think you should go first. Let's talk about money.
Oh, wait. I already forgot my list. That's how great I feel.
Facebook.
Oh, I have two things that I have beef with this week. One of them is daycare. A, it costs money. B, I'm sick all the time. And two, my real big beef is with Facebook right now. Because I decided to be like all the other suicide people and raise money in September for the first time. And I did that with a Facebook fucking fundraiser. And I raised $3,000 of my $5,000 motherfucking goal. And fucking Facebook decided they didn't like my fundraiser 3 weeks in, deleted it without saying anything to me, took all the money, it went away, and I don't know why. I wrote to them, and they keep being like, well, it violated our terms of service. And I'm like, okay, bot with a human name, how? And it keeps sending me
Is this
a
Riley
link.
again?
No, Riley has not made an appearance. I've gotten Emma, Logan, and I think Annie or some shit. No, they just keep sending me a link, and I'm like, I've asked 4 times what the specific reason was. So they're not telling me, and they're not giving me the money back, and it's very sad because that was like a lot of people wasting their time donating, thinking about what money they had available, like all of this shit that people have to do to donate to nice things that they care about, and Facebook was like, fuck you, Des. So
Yeah, that's a good beef.
pretty beefy.
Chris, you got any beefs?
I don't know if I have any. I have beefs, but I have to be very careful about how I talk about it.
I heard that you were not representing AAS this evening.
I was also not representing AAS at on the Hill yesterday after having several conversations with some folks about that potentially happening. The reason why I'm in DC this week. And we were told that at the last minute, mind you, a couple days before, that we weren't needed and that they had found some other people to attend. It was very strange. I've had long conversations about this week. Things on the Hill are very fast-paced and very unpredictable. And that probably hasn't come up today at all. Now that I think about it, it has been a crazy year today. So I don't know. I have to be very political about it, but I will just say that we had a really great event on Friday. Des was there to support to support the people. So that was really cool. But that thing yesterday kind of beefed me out. I don't even like saying beefed me out.
Can you say something about that thing yesterday?
I'm upset about that.
I feel like you were really vague.
Dolly, hush.
We were told. Okay, I'll say that. We were told that we were going to be able to represent ourselves, but also to provide our expertise, specifically about means restriction or means safety, which is something that we're really helpful, or that we're really supportive of, and that we are at least reviewing some legislation about. So it felt like we were connecting with this particular office, and we were summarily replaced with another organization.
Ah, okay. There we go.
What was it? We wanted to share the wealth? Was that the phrase?
Yes.
Ooh, gross. See, there's capitalism again. Yeah. Okay. Is it my turn for beefs? You know I have so many beefs.
Go. We have
beef?
15 minutes for more beef, so.
Beef
Well, I
pants?
can't be the only one for 15 minutes. Okay, so can we talk about the Zoloft thing?
Sure. I mean, I don't really have too much context for it. Hello,
Okay.
What's the Zoloft thing?
So a study comes out. It's like, hey, it turns out Zoloft doesn't help people with depression at all, which is what it's indicated for.
Oh, I thought you were talking about yourself in that tweet. I missed this information.
No.
Okay.
There was a study by an independent organization that found out, like, hey, when we actually studied Zoloft, like, people aren't really having the outcomes they're supposed to. It maybe helps people with anxiety, but it's not very good for depression. It doesn't have any impact. And, like, people have been saying this about Zoloft for fucking ever. Like, I feel like I know very few people who are like, Zoloft is awesome. That was the great, but it's one of the first things people get put on for depression. So, like, people are going to the doctor and they're getting Zoloft for their depression, and then they're like, oh, this isn't working. And the doctor generally will, like, tell you have to stay on Zoloft for, like, you have to stay on your medication for longer and longer and longer, so that it builds up in your system so you feel better. And it turns out all of these people were right. But instead of listening to anybody's fucking lived experience about this for years and years and years, we've just been prescribing Zoloft for something that it doesn't work for at all. And I'm sure there are people who had good experiences with Zoloft. This isn't really about Zoloft at all. What it's about is that we have to wait years and years and years for research to confirm things that lived experience has been telling people forever. And that's just pervasive throughout mental health, like research and suicide prevention research, is that we won't trust lived experiences first. We have to always get a researcher to take 20 years to prove it later. If they even care to prove it at all.
We've got a bunch of people saying Zoloft fucked them all up.
Yeah, Zoloft's bad. I mean, I don't want to say that because I think people should use whatever drugs they want to like get by, because the world is like fucked up. But like including prescription ones. But I think that it's it was oversold to us.
Prescription medications being oversold?
Yeah.
The fuck?
I know.
Unfamiliar.
Crazy, unfamiliar territory here. Anyway, so I have beefs about Zoloft. That's one of my big ones.
What else do you have beefs
Did
about?
you?
I mean, I'm still mad about my back. It's still fucked up, and like it's fucked up from stuff that happened in the hospital where fucked up things happened to me. So it makes me have to think about that every day. So I just like wake up with like creating this like cold diamond of hate in my heart. So that's a beef I have, just like slowly crushing all of these trauma feelings down into a diamond of hate.
That's very beautiful phrasing, Jess.
Yeah. Beef
Diamond
corner
of hate.
Yeah.
Now it's going to be beefy diamond corner.
No, I don't like that. Chris doesn't like that one either.
Chris,
okay,
what would you call it?
Call what?
Beef corner.
I'm not gonna say to change it at all. Honestly, like I said, it makes me uncomfortable, but I feel like I need to be challenged sometimes, and I'm okay with that. It's gonna happen.
Right.
Oh, now I have to sneeze.
All right, so
just like suicide.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a beef.
That's a beef. Yeah, the contagion, the suicide contagion.
The
way that
thing.
the way you know what? I feel like people just need to talk about suicide better.
Really?
That's your beef.
If they just do it right, no one would kill themselves.
Oh. Well, shit.
You guys knew this, right?
Yeah.
You know what? You know what'd be really great is if people could follow the reporting recommendations for suicide prevention in every facet of their lives. Because that's what it's meant for. It's meant for the depiction of suicide. It's meant for how we discuss it individually between one another.
Gross. Sorry.
It's meant for how dogs bark about suicide prevention. I feel like people need to give it a chance.
Hello, wait. Hello.
I feel like Chris is trying to push a button on me for me to talk about how much I hate safe messaging guidelines. But yeah, I have a beef with safe messaging as well.
We have 10 more minutes, so beef it up.
I think my beefy point there was just that, like, we need to, I think, as a field, remember that we have zero evidence that these things, that talking about suicide in any way whatsoever causes suicide on a one-to-one basis. And we do not know at an individual scale that anything that we say about suicide kills people. We don't have the evidence.
Laura wants us to talk about how we want to talk about suicide differently, but organizations won't let us.
Oh. Yeah.
Beefy.
I have found myself with an organization that lets me say anything I want about suicide, and it's crazy. But not everyone wants to hear that, so it's not like I'm always going to get a platform for it. But I think, yeah, overwhelmingly, organizations want you to tell stories about suicide that support their work, right? So if their work is about specific types of interventions, then they want you to talk about how that intervention works. No matter how, like, simplistic you're going to do that, simplistically you're going to do that. So if you're in primary prevention, they want to say, like, someone reached out to me and then I got help and everything was better. That's the story that you're allowed to tell. Whatever you're connected to, they want you to affirm their work. And I think that some people's stories will affirm that work and some of them don't. Many of them don't.
Well, we have all those scientific research studies to back up all of this too. So
yeah. So I think that's what's really interesting to me is, like, in suicide prevention, we don't actually, like, have very good data at all about what causes suicide, but we have all kinds of caution about, like, doing things that we say will cause suicide. So it's like all of these rules based on no evidence, but then we pretend there's science. Because basically everything's decided by expert consensus, right?
My favorite, and I know I'm simplifying this, I know I'm being overly facetious with this, but my favorite is that we tell people that suicide is not the result of one thing, right? It's not caused by one certain single thing. It's a confluence of factors, blah, blah, blah. But then we have potential contagion effects population level effects from one report or one bad thing being said in the thing.
Right.
So, now what?
No.
Right?
I mean, I don't want to go, like, 13 reasons why, because Des hates it, but
no,
but yeah, I think, like,
you do you.
No, I think that's, like, we just find something to panic about, and it's like, it's almost like this really great distraction from the fact that, like, suicide prevention is, like, impotent at their work. So, like, we're like, oh, hey, that was, maybe I shouldn't have said that.
It's awkward. I was thinking about all the old white guys who run this shit.
Oh. I don't take it back. I changed my mind. Suicide prevention is impotent, and so we, like, find these other things to panic about and to point fingers at, and like, as if there's, so we contradict ourselves constantly in this space around how we think about suicide, and there's, like, no self-reflection within the field about how we can say, like, suicide is never singularly caused, and also you singularly caused suicide, Netflix.
Right.
And why don't you take out that one suicide scene, but leave in everything else fucked up that was in there? Like, that's fine. Well, will be great if they watch hours and hours of sexual assaults, but not a suicide.
Yeah, I do love some good sexual assault content.
Yeah, that doesn't make people want to kill themselves at all.
No.
Anyway, so beef.
Beef corner.
13 reasons beef.
13 kinds of beef.
I promised Des before we started this that I would not talk about 13 Reasons Why, and I would just like to say that I made it to episode 3.
I mean, I don't really remember you making that promise, so that's fine.
I said it right before the first episode. I broke the other promises I said before the first episode.
Yeah, you did.
In like 5 minutes.
Yeah,
but
yes. You really
yeah. I haven't named names.
I mean, you basically...
Explicitly. Yeah.
Let me look at the comments here. We got anything good?
They got any beef?
Joel wants to pet a horsey.
Oh.
13 reasons no.
Me too. Joel also said, expert consensus and guidelines are based around keeping experts in control to keep them experts. So if something goes wrong or gets worse, then it's not the expert's fault; it's the person it happened to.
Yeah, exactly.
Des, how do we live with the fact that we helped make a version of reporting recommendations?
Jess, you just calm your tits.
I got beefs with both of you.
Look, I have to work with these guidelines within my interviews, or I used to. I used to be like, okay, I'm gonna make safe messaging, and I mean, I do pay attention to that still, like with methodology, really. But over time, what I noticed was that some stories you can't tell without including that information. Like, even if you're trying to think of, like, fuck the professionals, but if you're trying to think of other people with lived experience who are going to read it and might be like, that might fuck them up, because I work on this site, like, I do this for us. So that's the frame that I'm always looking at through. But if there's a story where the method, like, you have to include it. There's a woman, Suzanne, who attempted suicide in the bathroom at school, much like someone else here. And, but she found God that day. So, like, can't take that out. She found her meaning. Yeah, it wasn't you, was it?
That was not me. I found God.
So in that way, like, I've been able to work with the guidelines to make them better fit my purposes and the purposes of telling our stories better. But I think, like, to me, the guidelines should not be about contagion. They should be about framing stories so that we're changing the way the public perceives suicide and thinks about suicide. So, I mean, when I'm using them, it's for that purpose. And I don't feel bad about it because I was the one who pushed for that little tiny section in the guidelines that we use for AAS that talks about framing.
Yep.
So I feel
and two things. Kate said, "Are all of us attempt survivors?" Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And then Elise actually she said that, like, there are parts that she likes about reporting recommendations, or guidelines, and so, like, I mean, they're good and bad, right? It's not all crap, and I agree with Des. I mean, generally, and this is exactly how I frame it with anybody who I talk to, who wants to use any of these guidelines for any of the number of reasons that people feel like they need to use them, even though they're not supposed to be using them for that. But I always talk about intention, purpose, how it fits within the narrative of what you're trying to tell. And if it goes against the guidelines, then it's probably not, like, if it still serves your purpose and your purpose is what you want it to be and it's effective, then who's anybody else to tell you that you shouldn't be saying one thing or another, right?
Yeah. They're guidelines.
Well,
they're recommendations.
Yes.
Well,
I think my thing about that is that, like, we ought to be careful that we are not using people's stories to further an agenda that is not their agenda. And I think oftentimes that is what happens to people, is that people are exploited and the guidelines are a way. They're like a weapon that's used to exploit people, or to push their stories to be certain things. And I don't think that that's true for everyone that uses them or all the time. But I I think that it puts pressure on people to tell their stories in specific ways because those are the stories that get told.
And that's probably not just that's probably not just isolated to suicide prevention or suicide attempt survivors either. I think it may be, and I don't know enough about necessarily some other fields like sexual assault or domestic violence, but I don't know if they have reporting on those things, like reporting recommendations on those things, or like concrete toolkits or guidelines or whatever. But if they don't, I mean, that's one thing that could separate our field and make it easier to do exactly what you're saying, Jess.
Yeah, I think some other fields do a little bit, but not quite in the same way.
Like, does cancer have a reporting recommendation guideline?
No, probably not.
I think it's got mandates. In about 6 days, we're all going to be mandated to fucking wear some pink and pony up all our money to Sosa G. Coleman.
I saw somebody raising money for them, and I got a little irky.
Yeah.
There's a beef. Got a beef with that.
Lots of beef with the cancer industrial complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also have beef with people in suicide prevention trying to talk about how we should be more like the cancer industrial complex. I don't like that. That's a comparison that we make a lot, and I'm like, suicide's not like cancer. Why do we keep doing that?
Well, I think it's like cancer in terms of like acceptance, or we want it to be like cancer in terms of like public acceptance.
Sure, but I think it's just like much more relatable to other things that people have more agency in.
Say more.
Right, like like substance use. Yeah.
All right, guys, we've run 2 minutes over on Beef Corner.
So we're going to talk about money again?
Yeah.
I
mean, I don't know that we ever really stopped talking about money. Maybe for
no. It's pretty hard to get me to shut up about capitalism.
Oh, I had thought about this earlier and I forgot about it until right now. It sort of overlaps from the beef to the money.
Yeah.
Into nonprofits.
Uh-huh.
Specifically with things like reporting recommendations or certain toolkits that people create or proprietary trainings they feel like they've pulled out of their asses. And I've noticed, and it's definitely not a new trend at all, at all. This is definitely something that has been in the field for a long, long time and has just been accepted. And creating these sort of strange products that are used to then market other services. And not like, I'm not talking about crisis centers, I'm talking about other nonprofits who will say, like, here's a product, and tangentially, I have links to all of my other products, and I also have, but none of these things are evidence-based. They're all things that, like, my other old white guy friends and I kind of came up with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
yeah.
I didn't say that one.
That was me.
I was just reminding.
I won't.
So I'm not sure where I'm going with this necessarily in that, but it seems like it's almost similar to citing your own research when you're writing a new
or like
article.
Only citing your own research.
Only citing your own research, right? It feels a little bit circular, and it also feels super exploitative.
Yes.
Like you're looking, you Googled something. You Googled how to support loss survivors, or you Googled how to recover from a suicide attempt, and now you're presented with what essentially amounts to evangelical suicide prevention materials that you may or may not have to pay for, or you're shuffled towards something that that is even more exploitative.
Right.
I don't know. I've noticed this kind of like this trickling of crud.
Yeah, and it's stuff that's like ancillary to like suicide prevention sometimes, and sometimes it's like right in bed with all the rest of it. Because there are for-profit suicide prevention organizations.
Yeah.
Like those exist, and they're selling products.
Yep.
And they're all connected to like all of that same government shit that we talked about before, like all of that like evidence-based. We'll put that in quotes because there's not evidence. But the evidence-based programs or evidence-based interventions, like there are a slew of gatekeeper trainings, which is like, can we get a better name? Like, I guess we shouldn't get a better name because that's what they are. But it's like fucked up to sell a training that's called a gatekeeper training.
Can we get a better
because it's literally like gatekeeping. That's bad. Usually in every other circumstance, gatekeeping is bad. But in this circumstance, it's supposed to be about like any person off the street can be the gatekeeper between this person and suicide or this person and help. So like you can support them. But all of those trainings basically encourage like surveillance and funneling people into a system that doesn't have actual interventions that help them. So we're really just teaching people to ask about suicide. If we're even doing that, and a lot of them don't have an evidence base that people actually go out and ever talk to people about suicide after to begin with. But there's like a whole industry that is making money off of this. And some of those strategies, some of those tools were developed through government funding and now are supported through like government contracts as well. So like some of the ones we were talking about before that are commonly used in crisis centers and all kinds of other places, schools, all of that.
Should we just have, we should rename them from gatekeeper to gaslighting trainings.
I mean, yeah, both. They're a little
You're not suicidal.
You are not.
Or like if you are, we're gonna call 911.
Yeah.
So there's a section of for-profit suicide prevention, which just basically seems bad all around to me. But then there's the nonprofits. And to me, there's like two categories of like fucked up in the nonprofit world. Oh, there's more than that probably, but there's like two categories of fucked up that I want to talk about, which is that there's this sort of constant churning of creating new small nonprofits that have like no substantive or evaluative programming that are designed to like raise awareness. Usually it's people who have lost someone, so they have really good motivations, or people who have experienced a suicide crisis and feel like they know how other people can get through that crisis. So they create their own nonprofit, and their goal is to raise awareness. And a lot of times what they're doing is like going into schools and doing like Suicide Dare, which was not effective for drugs and is also not effective around suicide. But we have like adults just running into schools. And
do you know how much Dare shirts go for now?
Right. Well, I mean, if there was a Suicide Dare shirt, I would buy that right now.
We make them.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, do we now?
We're the ones who make those. I think Stay is the Suicide Dare shirt.
Can we? I'm gonna check and see if we can't have some of those for the conference. That would be pretty badass. Yeah.
Yeah, you and me will just wear those. That'll be cool. We'll be really.
No. I mean like we'll have those available.
Oh, okay.
I'm confused about what's happening now.
Okay, so Suicide Dare. It's like basically you go in and you scare people of the like they're using fear tactics about suicide. They're like, here's how horrible it was when my person that I lost killed themselves. Don't do that to your family. Which is basically like, this is your brain on drugs, or like, here, look at all these drugs, but don't do them. It's like taking ice cream scoops out of your brain, which is all like not true, and is like a really, so I understand why people who are in pain want to do things like that because they think it helps. So there's this kind of group of nonprofits that often raise a lot of community money for tactics that are really, I think, harmful in the long run. But then there's also like the sort of conservative nature of these like massive nonprofits that are sort of like this big like wheel of like creating their own. They create research and they fund research that affirms the work that they're doing and the things they believe in. And so it's just this cycle that feeds itself. But neither of those two is having any kind of substantial impact on whatever the goals of suicide prevention might be.
Can we have people go into schools and have suicide goggles?
Like the beer goggles?
Like beer goggles?
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't wear those goggles because like been there and it was rough.
I've never worn those. I was not.
Either.
Oh, you mean like suicide goggles?
Suicidal? Yeah.
You mean suicide goggles? I thought you meant the beer
Suicide
goggles.
Yeah, I wear those every so often.
Yeah, I don't want to get them at school. I don't want to have to go to school to wear them.
No, I get those out of the drawer, and I'm like, hey.
What's up, old friend?
Yeah, no, I can't count. I mean, like, there were definitely a few times where motivational speakers would come in, and that's the thing, right? They're considered motivational speakers a lot of times, at least when I was in school.
Yeah.
And they would say things like, for the sake of your family, or for the sake of your friends, because you don't know how much pain you're going to put your loved ones through,
Right.
if anything were to happen to you. And it's exactly what we tell people not to say. It's shameful, and it's moralistic, and it's kind of cruddy. But like you're saying, and I'm not going to try to discourage anybody from doing something that helps them heal by any means. But I would encourage anybody, and this is something that I try to talk about as much as possible, because it's very frustrating in that we have so many people who've experienced either a personal loss or a personal experience with suicide. So awareness is good. We're all set on awareness, right?
Yeah, like we know.
We got it. And so having some general awareness about resources is always cool. But we know, actually, we do have a little bit of research that shows that just awareness by itself doesn't do crap. So
can be harmful.
And it can be harmful, right? Because you're just saying, yeah, some people get suicidal, right? All right, see you later.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think what I try to tell people is that, like, if you've experienced something, if you know somebody who's experienced something, and they're trying to find something to do, go to your local crisis center first and see if there are resources that they know about, if you can volunteer, like if you're in a place to do that. If not, they might have information on other local nonprofits that have already started trainings you can look at that may or may not fit. Right, so there's a whole bunch of different things, but look at Google stuff. Google extensively, within reason. Obviously, don't go into like gory shit that's going to re-traumatize you. But like, do a little bit of research, find out what's out there, and like if you've exhausted as much as you possibly can go through, and you're still convinced that what you have in terms of creating an idea for a nonprofit is unique and helpful. At that point, no one can stop you from doing it at any point. Yes. But like, do some research, do some background, and then also, right. Well, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, make sure you give yourself some time to grieve. And when you're looking at doing something like this, are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for others? And either one of them is okay, right? Like, or are you doing it for a combination of the two? Are you doing it as a way to heal while doing what we hear so much is that I don't want anything like this to happen to anybody else? Are you combining the two? Are you only doing it for yourself? Or are you only doing it for other people? All of them are equally valid. Know which one you're doing it for, though. Like, have that little bit of self-awareness and understand what your goal is, and that's going to make things much more effective when you're working on what you're doing.
And I think there's this other piece that, like, after these things occur, there's this sort of feeling of like being alone that a lot of people have, and if we could channel energy into spaces where people can find peer support, or if people were, like, instead of doing like Suicide Dare, if people were creating like groups that were supportive of like loss survivors. So that's the experience. If you're only a loss survivor, you know what it means to be a loss survivor. And then you have the expertise to help people like you. But it doesn't mean you have the expertise to help people who are having the experience of like suicidal thoughts. And I'm a loss survivor and a suicide attempt survivor, and I think I have more expertise about being a suicide attempt survivor. But I just think it's helpful for us to like remember what our expertise is in. And that lived experience can be expertise, but it's not expertise in everything.
We also frequently get discounted as lost survivors too, though, which really pisses me off. It's like, come on, a lot of us, we got crossovers, intersections.
You can be more than one thing at once.
What?
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah. But then I also think like some of the things that happen in that small nonprofit space are replicated in this like massive, deeply unsettling way at the big nonprofit, like national nonprofit level as well. So like, just like there's those programs that are like going, just some people who lost someone who want to go into a school and use scare tactics. Like we also have these like national nonprofits who are going into schools and doing gatekeeper trainings that don't have a like significant evidence base about like preventing suicide in the long run either. And so they're doing similar things, just, maybe with they have more of that like funnel to create a body of evidence for what they say they're doing.
We have a question.
Ooh.
From Lena. Can you talk about the disproportionate amount of money that goes to youth suicide prevention?
Yes.
Yes, I can. You have 4 minutes.
Most of the money goes to youth suicide prevention. Kids get suicidal, and sometimes they die from suicide, but also so do adults. We funnel so much money into youth suicide prevention, but most of those strategies that exist for youth suicide prevention are in that sort of gatekeeper model that doesn't have any kind of like long-term or statistically significant evidence base at scale. So we throw a whole lot of money at something and don't always help.
What about, can I name names? I'm not calling them out or anything. I'm not necessarily asking for a real opinion, but groups like Sources of Strength that have pretty comprehensive models that go into schools. They train a buttload of people within the schools. They have peer leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, like that, and it's not just suicide prevention, right? It's wellness
right.
on a roundabout. So I'm not saying that one in particular, but like those kinds of concepts make a lot of sense to me.
I think they do when they're implemented with fidelity. And I think the reality, like having worked in primary prevention for a long time, I have never seen something scale and be implemented to fidelity. So what you have happening is people are picking and choosing parts of those programs to implement. So then it's not the whole thing. And the parts that they're implementing are the like one-off training stuff, and then like some kind of project-based learning for students.
Like, you're absolutely right. So like with the good behavior game, so many classrooms just have coins.
Right. Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. So when we're not implementing, if there's a program that does have some evidence, if we don't implement with fidelity, you've lost the credibility of that program and the efficacy in your area anyway.
So why does so much money go to youth though? Why is there such a disproportionate allocation?
I think it's an easier sell, because I think there's a lot of like moralizing around suicide. It's like people don't think kids should die no matter what, but I think there's some disagreement about whether we should spend a lot of money keeping adults from killing themselves culturally. That's just, I don't know if that's the case, but I think that might be.
Well, I mean, obviously we know that like, elderly suicide gets very, very, very little funding, very little attention. And I've always had at least the suspicion that people generally think, oh, well, people in their old age, they've lived a long life and they don't have a whole lot left to give. And, it's a completely different, like you said, it's a cultural shift.
Well, I hear things like that about disabled people as well. So like not having specific kind of interventions or support for disabled people is sort of justified by like, oh, I get why they might want to kill themselves. So it's like if we can understand why we think someone would want to kill themselves, then we're not putting energy and effort into that, but there's something about young people that we think needs to be protected differently.
Well,
but I think we also are more likely to use force and coercion with young people, which is a
lovely
place.
Easier.
Right,
easier.
because their parents can just sign off on it.
Mm-hmm. She's beeping. Yeah.
I didn't realize I was muted. It's the hour.
It's the hour.
Over.
Time is up.
Everyone's just so mad right now.
Everyone's really, really happy that Des brought that thing. So hey, next week though, Chris is coming back.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about, or 2 weeks. Yeah, 2 weeks from now, we're going to talk about.
I like how he forgot.
Like movies and stuff, and suicide in them.
And what else?
That doesn't happen.
I'm really excited because I have a lot of like weird study I have done on this just independently when I was like, I wonder how many times suicide gets mentioned in Friends. So I'm going to share like a whole bunch of like real stupid knowledge about that stuff with y'all.
We're going to have a whole section on what?
What?
We're going to have a whole section on
ritual suicides. Really excited. I've been waiting to talk about ritual suicide this whole time.
This whole month.
Ritual suicide right now. So anyway, we're going to talk about that and horror movies in particular. Please. So yeah.
I have a feeling there's going to be like way more than one episode about this bullshit with the two of you around.
I mean, yeah, I will do it again if we need to or want to.
And again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's all, folks.
All right. Okay.
Is that how you end things?
I don't know, but now I need like Porky Pig going.
You need
You're way better at
Looney Tunes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna stop this because I'm actually, but not because I want to be, which is different. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.